other main guy, this guy called Steve. He'll be speaking shortly. I should tell you that we're going to leave here right now at 2 o'clock. Yeah, well, that's the clock is wrong, obviously, but we leave on time at 2 o'clock. We're going to head down to the Clapham area. Meanwhile, you'll be having a commentary from our guide and bits from me as well. We're going to go to Clapham first, then turn around at Clapham, and then head back up into Elephant Castle area, cross the bridge into Westminster, and then go through Trafalgar Square, Strand, Tower Hill, etc. And on this 2.5-hour trip, we'll be showing you all the amazing African Caribbean history you can see or find out about in the streets and architecture of London's amazing, interesting city. So the timeline is that we're going to leave now, and we should be back here at this point. But between 4:30 and 5 o'clock itself, we have half an hour buffer time for traffic and roadworks, right? Because in London, you can have a demonstration, you can have roadworks, you can have an incident, etc. So you have to bear in mind to have that half-hour buffer time. But we're going to head off now. We can actually we can off. You can go if you want to. We're going to head off now. We'll head down to Clapham, and as we drive along, you're going to hear a lot of stories about this amazing city. So on board the ship, sorry, I should have mentioned we have a river cruise as well. So just yesterday we did a river cruise on River Thames, which we do all the time, and this is a bus tour. And we also have about 15 different walking tours of London from an African Caribbean perspective. So on board the bus today, we have people from South Africa. Any South Africans here? Yeah, we got some amazing African Americans. Yes. You forgot. Right. And I think we have some guys from London too. And what you'll hear is that while we're driving, you're gonna hear about connections between definitely America, a little bit of South Africa too, and definitely lots of Caribbean history and African history. So the whole thing is kind of quite interesting and it's connected to the entire world. But as I say, I'm just like the introduction act, because if you go to see Beyonce in concert, she doesn't come on straight away. You have a kind of a warm-up act. So it's a bit like I am like Peter Andre to the main guy who's going to speak now. Peter Andre to Beyonce. That's a comparison you can make, right? So the main man you're going to hear about today or from today is a guy called S.I. Martin. Steve is a historian with like 30 years of experience. He's produced or been on TV with a number of different documentaries. He's got about 7 books out, including a book called Jupiter Amidships, about a young African boy in the 1800s who's a sailor, amazing stories designed for children. He's also been republished by Penguin Books. His book called Incomparable World is now, or just was produced into an opera in Chicago, right? So this guy has an opera on Black history in Chicago. And also that book, Incomparable World, has been made into a TV series by Ridley Scott's company. Now, Ridley Scott, of course, made Gladiator, Blade Runner. So he's making this guy's book into a kind of a TV series. That's the level of quality of caliber guy you have on board the ship. Bus, right? And apart from Steve, you also have me on board. My name is Tony Warner. I'm from Black History Walks. We organize walks, lots of Black History Walks all year long. And we have a book out, so if you're in the bookshop just now, you might have seen the book Black History Walks Volume 1. That is my book, and it details some of the history that's in London from a black perspective. So, without further ado, let me just hand the mic across to Mr. Steve Martin, sorry.
Yeah, I'm worth $6 million. I'm glad to see there's people old enough to remember that one. Okay, good afternoon everyone. On behalf of our Black History Walks, I'd just like to thank you for taking the time out of your busy weekends to join us on this exploration of the Black history of London. When we talk about the Black history of London, obviously we're passing through Brixton, and it's got a lot of associations with the Black presence. You know how the Black presence is always contemporary, always recent. The most pressing associations are with the events of the spring of 1981 and the uprisings which took place here following excessive police presence and arrests in this area, particularly to our right and along Railton Road. But for the purposes of this tour, we're going into some deep history. We're going back into the past, and for the purposes of Brixton, I'd just like to take you back 301 years to 1722, because yes, there were Black people living in and around here then, and amongst those that we know of was a fascinating woman who just went by the name of the Black Woman at Brixton Causeway. And of course, she wouldn't need a name because how many black women were there living along this stretch of road, Brixton Road, which then went by the name Brixton Causeway. This particular woman was living there. We know about her because she entered the public record in November of that year. She is she is flagged up as asking or receiving money from the church, parish funds, poor relief, for the care of herself and, excuse the period language, her bastard child. So basically she has given birth to a child, the father is not around, and she's just living somewhere on Brixton Road. Now, she gets a lot of attention, a lot of care, because she's clearly known to the parish. I mean, I don't know how many black women were living around Brixton Road, Brixton Causeway 301 years ago, but there she is with her child, who she gives birth to around December, January. She was receiving money all the way into March of that year. The extraordinary thing about that is that for some reason, we don't know why, she manages to pay the money back. And it's a lot of money that she's been given for swaddling for her child. She's also given money for her own clothing and milk for the child, interestingly. So she must have been fairly ill herself. Really fascinating story. I could go on about it, and I'll try and touch on aspects of it as we go further on. Obviously, we're talking a lot about the 18th century on this tour, and we're looking at the impact of the black presence when it first starts generally establishing itself across this city. People of all statuses. I don't have time to talk about John Duke and his other group of black cohorts who were living in Brixton in 1722, and that there were a large number of black men living in and around Brixton who attended their brother's funeral in that year and laid out clothes for him and gave him a dignified burial. But just a taste of what is to come. We're coming up to Stockwell, where we're going to take a left towards Clapham. And as we come up to the lights, depending on how much time we've got to linger there, I want to direct your attention to the right as we come up to the lights before we take the turn, and you'll see something comparatively, in fact, fairly unusual even today, which is a statue, the statue of the Bronze Woman, as it's called, and it was the second statue of a black woman certainly in London, possibly in Britain as well. We're going to be turning fairly quickly, but no, we've got the luxury of stopping. Those of you on the right of the bus will be able to see the clock tower. Those of you with ultra sharp X-ray vision will be able to see at ground level there is a statue by the clock tower of a woman, the Bronze Woman, holding up her child to the skies. Are there any local people on the bus?
Yo!
Okay, that's about right. Okay. Those of you who would like to visit it, please go and have a look close up, because it's a remarkable thing. It's one of only a handful of statues to black women, probably less than 4 in the capital. And this was the second. It was put up in 2008, and it was put up at the behest of the poet and activist Cecile Nobrega, who of course wrote a poem to accompany it, and that gives the sense of it. So I'll read out a chunk of what she wrote. The Bronze Woman. Find me a place in the sun, in the sea, on a rock near an isle in the Caribbean. There I'll set her, honoured, free, to be kissed and petted by the wind, free to be washed with the brine of sweet and bitter memories, free to be stubborn and steadfast as night. Dark is her destiny, wrong her right. Woman of bronze, symbol of slavery, free, strength, sweat and toil. Who can foil your quest for best to give your child? One night, a woman says, the book went to him late in the gloomy darkness of the night, went to him the light, for places for her sons at the left, the right, to sit beside him, capital H. Chide her not, Mother instinct is the same today as then forevermore. However mild, she seeks the betterment of her child. Now, of course, what she's talking about is the struggle of women of African origin, particularly in the Western world, for dignity, for security, and basically for security for their children, and basically for humanity as well. And we're going to be looking at a fair amount of street furniture and signage on this tour, because one of the things you'll notice, both Londoners and visitors, is that there is very little signage and street furniture signifying, flagging up the black presence. And I will stress again, we are talking about a presence which goes back hundreds of years, and we'll be looking at some of those who have been remembered, and also a lot who have been forgotten. And I have to state as well that one of the functions, or duties even, of Black History Walks is being at the forefront of erecting plaques and public signage of all sorts, so that these stories are in our public memory. And together with organizations like the Nubian Jack Foundation, this is a really, really interesting twist in the commemoration of Black histories, which is basically the fact that it's community-led. Oh yeah, so just as we're going into Clapham, which has got all sorts of associations, just a little bit of filler about John Duke, the black servant who died in Brixton in 1722 and was buried by Henry Mondox, his best friend, we imagine, and other black men. One of the interesting things about the 18th century is the sense of community cohesion that you get. And obviously, given the smaller numbers we're looking at in the 18th century, with perhaps a high point of 12, 13, maybe 14,000 in the 1780s, although it's a very distinct and visible minority community, it's still a community under all sorts of pressures. It's a very diverse community. We're talking about people from, and I don't want to go all Bridgeton on you, believe me, I do not want to go to Bridgeton, but you're talking about people who are very prosperous, very successful, to the vast majority of people who are living in beggary, in absolute poverty from hand to mouth. Lots of former soldiers, former sailors and their families. People of all stripes who find they have to stick together and perform those public duties for themselves and each other, as were illustrated by the death and passing of John Duke. There are loads and loads of stories of that sort, and we'll pick up some of them later on in this tour. So we're heading now into Clapham, and it's a place with a couple of very prominent associations with black history. First and foremost, you have the presence of the Clapham sect. The Clapham sect, for those who are unaware of it, was that group of white philanthropists and parliamentarians, men of the cloth, who were top front and center in pushing through the parliamentary case for abolition. People like the Venns, who were connected to the Church of Holy Trinity, which will flag up as we leave Clapham. People like the Thorntons, the family of bankers, interestingly. People like Zachary Macaulay, who I'll talk at greater length in a very short while, who was a former governor of the colony of Sierra Leone, amongst other things. What's interesting about them is that they were living here. If you can imagine, well, Londoners on the bus, how many are you?
Yeah.
Okay, Londoners on the bus. If you can imagine this area 200, 300 years ago, this was fabulously wealthy, especially as we go towards the common. Just cast your eye around this patch of green. These are some handsome properties. Some of the wealthiest people in London, in Britain, lived here. And of course, amongst those wealthy were those who had made their fortunes from the trade in human lives, etc., etc. And it's very, very interesting that side by side you had these two constituencies. Some of the biggest traders in human lives, families like the Greens, the Trevelyan's, into whom Zachary Macaulay's daughter actually married. His daughter Hannah married into a slaving family, interestingly. Families like the Martins, and yes, that is where my name comes from as well. Samuel Martin, the factor for the island of Antigua, was a resident. And families like the Hibberts, they all lived around here side by side with members of the Clapham sect. And it's very, very telling that even though these sugar and slave men were their political opponents, they socialized with members of the Clapham sect, and it's all very, very messy and very, very incestuous. But yes, William Wilberforce, I should have mentioned, the great and quite fascinatingly controversial liberator. He was also a member of the most prominent member of the Clapham sect. But we're going to talk about Macaulay and some of his activities as we make our way around the round Clapham Common. But the other association number one, association number two, we'll be looking at in about 40 seconds, and that is the presence of recent black arrivals in London in the summer of 1948. And of course I'm talking about the arrival of the Windrush, the ship which brought over 492, mostly Jamaican, mostly men, amongst other passengers, of course. Those black male passengers who did not have forwarding addresses were sent to the station we are going to see as we make a right turn in a moment. That station, of course, being Clapham South. Clapham South was chosen because it has had a very deep shelter, deep bomb shelter. It was used as a deep bomb shelter during the Second World War, and it was seen as a fitting place to house some of these arrivals, black arrivals in 1948. There are some extraordinary photographs of these young men, mostly young men, as they're arriving. I'm imagining most of you have seen these photographs of these incredibly well-dressed young men with snappily brimmed hats set at a rakish, jaunty angle. And you can just imagine them looking for work constantly, returning to Clapham South, which we'll see in a minute when we make the right turn. You'll see it, those of you on the left will have the best view of it. I mean, imagine sailing across the Atlantic, looking for work, looking for a future, and your bed for the night is the deep shelter, the bomb shelter, right here. Those of you in the front of the coach are already seeing the train station, the tube station, Clapham South. And as we turn, those of you on the left-hand side of the coach will be entertained by, can entertain a larger view. And I often like to think of, the journey that these men would have taken from this train station on foot, going down to Acre Lane, then down onto Cold Harbour Lane, past Brixton Road onto Cold Harbour Lane, and going to the Labour Exchange to look for work. Because it's often forgotten that they came here looking for work. They were serious, very, very serious people. And of course, they had to contend with a lot of racism, a lot of objection to their presence here. And they would often go to the Labour Exchange and come away empty-handed. This would be the Labour Exchange on Cold Harbour Lane. And rather than make that journey to and fro from Clapham to Brixton on a daily basis twice, a lot of those gentlemen chose to just live or find lodgings, rack-rented, leprous, nasty, hot bedding lodgings opposite the Labour Exchange, places like Somerleyton Road, Geneva Road, and they basically formed the foundation of the modern black presence in Brixton and its associations with not just Caribbean, but particularly Jamaican culture. So fairly long, vigorous roots we're talking about. And I can't refrain from mentioning as well, when I look at one particular photo, you know, he's talking about very, very serious people. There's one photograph which always struck me, and it's of a young man, who is preparing to bed down for the night in his underground shelter. And he is preparing his pajamas. And you can see that his pajamas have got a perfect crease in them. I mean, a perfect crease. And my question, of course, is, you know, I'm a scruffy person, so I mean, what are pajamas? But what are ironed pajamas? Where did he find the time, the inclination to do this and to keep up this sort of appearance? You know, he has to be taking himself, incredibly seriously, incredibly focused. And of course, many of them did find work in the building trades and in public services, transport, most notably. But yeah, hundreds of stories locked up in fact, even where we are now, in the post-Windrush period, there was a very significant settlement of Caribbean people all around Clapham, which is now almost sounds like science fiction. Yes. So as we're taking this very corner, we're actually passing a bit of forgotten invisible history. We're passing one of the two schools that were opened for young African boys and girls between 1799 and 1805, the African Academy they were collectively called. We just passed, because it's not signposted, it could have been anywhere on that turn we just took on Battersea Rise, the school which was for young girls from Sierra Leone, from prominent families from Sierra Leone. They were sent over here by their parents for basically an English education, as were 20 or 21 boys who were also sent over to be educated in a property. In fact, they had two properties, one on Clapham Common North side and the other in Clapham Old Town. The African Academy is absolutely fascinating because these young men have a very odd existence living in this wealthy part of Clapham, wealthy part of South London. Some of their families are very well to do. They are local traders. I struggle to say it, but I have to. One family in particular are actually traders in human lives, which must have been interesting in the dormitories of the night, given that some of their other fellow pupils were the sons of Maroons from Jamaica who had fought for their freedom, and having been sent out of the island of Jamaica, settled in Sierra Leone and quickly became middle class, who are all still there, the same names, the same families, the Creoles, who are still the, for want of a better expression, leading lights in Sierra Leone, as well as free blacks from North America, the Black Loyalists, who also ended up in Sierra Leone, and some of them ended up in Sierra Leone and similarly formed a new upper crust. And yeah, that upper crust is still there, but this is a subject I can bore anyone to tears on. The black presence in education in this period. There were schools specifically for wealthy black people. There were also private tutors, but of course the vast majority of people, white and black, young people, they did not have any formal education, and those who did were extremely lucky to have it. So again, I don't want to go all Bridgerton on you, because the whole story isn't about heroes and sheroes and success and glamour and glory, but these little examples do shine an interesting light, particularly when you look at what they were learning and how they were treated as African princes. Sorry, that was a deliberate cough, a sarcastic cough. Oh yeah, so the other set of people who lived around here, as I said, were the traders in human lives, those whose fortunes were built on that traffic across the Atlantic, and most prominent amongst them was the Hibbert family. This is one of those, if you don't catch it, you'll miss it, sort of pointer outs. The Hibberts were one of those families who, within a generation, became fabulously wealthy in Jamaica. They were the largest owners of human lives there on a number of plantations. They were also the largest, the wealthiest shippers of goods out of Jamaica. George Hibbert lived just around the corner. We're going straight on, but if you look left as we're traveling straight on, and look at the property just behind the bus stop. Yeah, it's now a hospice, and it's massive, absolutely massive. I've been in it, and it goes back for about a quarter of a mile of property. That was the London base of the Hibbert family. They also had a Jamaican base, they had a Seaford base, they had bases and homes all over. They were some part of that huge growth, explosion of I'm gonna say, yeah, they were the first millionaires in non-aristocratic millionaires in British history, and they were in a position to buy places buy seats in the House of Commons, and to buy public favour of all sorts. Absolutely fascinating place, this. And there is a Clapham tour for those of you particularly interested in this area, and it also includes that building on our left, which is doing its work today, the Church of Holy Trinity, and that is where the young people from the African Academy would be taken to worship, and they'd be worshipping side by side with the Hibberts, with the Greens, side by side with people who are buying and trading African lives, as well as side by side with the members of the Clapham sect. I mean, what I would give to be a fly on that particular wall. Very, very interesting set of intertwined histories here. But there is some push for some signage in Clapham Old Town to flag up the one of the sites of the African Academy, the Boys African Academy. And it's interesting as well, you know, what they're being taught. They're being taught also, you know, the regular sorts of subjects that you'd come across, such as geography, history, English. But they're also being taught boat building. You know, you can imagine them trooping off down to the waterfronts of Wandsworth, being taught boat building, because, you know, their families, many of their families were traders, trading up and down the river systems and the coasts of Sierra Leone. So, yeah, all sorts of histories locked into this landscape.
Steve mentioned something called hotbedding. Now, you might not know what hotbedding is, but hotbedding goes back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, and bit of the 80s too, whereby when you went to get accommodation, you would see signs that were saying, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. In your face, blatantly that. They'd be in the newspapers and the shop windows, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. So it's hard to get a place to stay. If you did get a place to stay, it would be in the rough, mashed up, bombed out inner city areas like Brixton, like Notting Hill, like Catford, like Hackney, those areas that were rough and bombed up, mashed up back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc. So you found a growing black population in those areas. But I should say that when they went to rent a property, the rent for a bed, because what they do is they rent out beds in the room, not just the apartment or the room in the apartment, they rent a bed in the room in the apartment to you, right? And the rent for the bed in the room in the apartment was so expensive that you had to do hot bedding, which is say you would get your best friend to get a job in the night shift, you'd get a job in the day shift, and you'd sleep in the same bed different times, right? Because the rent for the bed was so pricey, you had to have two sets of people to pay for the rent. That happened to my own dad. My dad had that experience back in South Norwood. So this is part of the background to how you had this development of settlements in certain parts of London. Because after a while of being ripped off for the rent, people just said, let me just buy my own house. But then of course you had racist banks, racist moneylenders who would not lend you money to buy your own house if you're black. So Jamaicans, St. Lucians would be refused access to capital. So what they did, they set their own banking system called a partner, Boxand, or Susu, right? Which means that if there's 10 of you from the same island, same village, you all get together, agree to put down, let's say, £100 per week into a pot, and 10 times 100 is 1,000. So somebody within that group of 10 would get £1,000 in that 10-week period. And after you got your what they call a hand, you then be able to buy a property. And I should mention that at this time, you could buy a 3-bed house in Brixton or Nottingham for £3,000. I'm talking about 50s, 60s, you could actually do that. Of course, that house now is worth £1 million, but it goes to show how, you know, these areas were developed, because it was the black community moved into these kind of rough bonder areas, and then they would actually kind of improve their house. They would build in, you know, double glazing, a finished basement, make it look nice and pretty, etc. So by virtue of their hard work, they actually improved the entire area. But on top of that now, let's say you just arrived here from Jamaica or Dominica, etc. You might want to have your jerk chicken, rice and peas, or your hard food, or your, you know, your what do you call it, your flying fish and cuckoo, etc. But ain't nobody here selling that kind of food. So what do? You then develop a restaurant or a market area to sell and buy and produce that kind of material for your community. So you then have what is called economic regeneration as well, whereby the communities moved into an area, improve the physical structure of the area, and also they now begin to supply these kind of unusual and different foods and experiences, which then attracts the local people, the white people, as it so to speak, to actually, wow, that car almost cut you up, man, Dash. Anyway, sorry. To actually buy this material, so you have this additional impact of the black community actually buying properties, fixing them up, having kind of areas of, you know, concentrated black settlement, and also providing this new food, new experiences for the indigenous, so to speak, white community. And we're going to come up to the Bronze Age very quickly. So watch to your left. Let me pass back to Steve.
Yeah, so those of you on the left, as we're going straight ahead, we'll be able to see firstly the clock tower and get a much better view of, at ground level, the statue of the Bronze Woman. So yeah, you can see it now on your left. She's there holding the child up. Okay, so as we're heading up towards the Oval, I'm obliged to ask, are there any football fans? Yeah, oh yeah, the deep voice, the bass notes, yeah. There's some football fans here. Okay, football fans and non-football fans, in fact, just an open question. For all of you, which country do you think produced the first black national captain? Which country, which national team was headed by the first black captain? Brazil. France, no. The first, no. No, not Nederlands, nee. No. First national team. No. I'll say it's in Europe. That's a big help. No, soccer. I'm talking about. No. America, no. We're talking about soccer. Is everyone stumped? Someone of you? Obviously, there's no one from north of the border on this bus, because you would know that the answer was Scotland. Yes, Scotland the Brave. In 1881, the Scottish team came out ready for action at the Oval in one of the first internationals they played ever against England, and their captain was the black man, Andrew Watson of Guyana. Yeah, Andrew Watson of Guyana. He still actually has living relatives in Liverpool who I met. Very interesting people. And Andrew Watson was the captain, and he led them to a 6-1 victory, or as the Scottish would say, a thrashing on England. And they will not let anyone forget that. They will not let you forget that. In fact, it's the largest Scottish victory over an English side in the, I was going to say friendlies, but they're not friendlies, between Scotland and England, when those two sides meet. So yeah, and it happened in 1881 at the Oval. We're at the Oval now. If you look very, very quickly after the station to your left, you'll see the Oval Stadium. It's basically it's known better as a cricket ground, but I know absolutely nothing about cricket, so I can't really help you on that score. But yeah, that's where it all took place. Very interesting little patch of London, this. On our right, we're coming up alongside Kennington Park. Yeah, formerly part of Kennington Common, common land, grazing land, where in 1848, 10th of April 1848, you saw a huge gathering of Britain's Chartists. It was the Chartist meeting in London of that year, and the Chartists, long story short, were basically that group. We wouldn't even call them radicals. That group of agitators and activists who are looking for that basic packet of rights that we enjoy when and if we choose to vote, namely that the ballot should be secret, that there shouldn't be any need to have money to stand for parliament and or vote or own property in order to do so, that there should be one man, one vote. They weren't progressive enough to think about women voting, but those were their humble demands, which are basically part of the packages of rights that we enjoy when we cast our ballots. Now, the leader of the London Chartists and the steward for the march was William Cuffy. William Cuffy, whose father came from St. Kitts, one of the many sailors who we will meet throughout these histories, settled in Chatham in Kent. Cuffy himself, William Cuffy, became a tailor and worked in London. He became radicalized, and because he was a powerful orator and had a commanding presence, even though he was 4'11", he had a commanding presence. He quickly rose within the ranks of the Chartist movement, which of course by now, in a very short time, became a national movement and is seen as a radical movement. When the Times wanted to put the Chartists down, they described them as the black man and his party. There were other people of African origin in the Chartist movement, also involved in activities around Kennington Common. A couple of weeks later, there was an earlier demonstration. William Cuffy himself, as the steward of that meeting, had a difficult decision. If he said, okay, we march on Central London today with our demands, he would have led, I am certain, the largest number of people imaginable to the largest loss of life in British domestic history. It would have been a massacre, because the powers that be were ready. The the royal family was sent to the Isle of Wight. There was a bourgeois militia of shopkeepers and clerks who were given clubs and all sorts of anti-personnel devices, as well as some nice clothes to wear. There was also the heavy guns were brought up from Woolwich Arsenal and mounted on the north bank of the Thames facing South London. So the powers that be, the powers that were ready. And William Coffey had a decision. Even though he was a physical force chartist, he believed in fighting the power. He realized that no, it would be a bad idea for the march to go ahead in the way it was originally intended. William Coffey did the right thing. He vanished, he got out of there, because even there was a sprinkling of black faces around, he was way too significant, to be in a position of prominence when the time came for arrests to be made. So he went underground, and he was discovered a few months later, where else but in a pub, drinking in central London, just off Theobald's Road, Red Lion Square, and he was sentenced to be transported to Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, where he eventually died after a comparatively long life in that brutal colony. But yeah, lots and lots of interesting stories, and I haven't got time to go into all of them. We're coming up into the redeveloped Elephant and Castle. There's only one flavoursome piece of architecture remaining in the Elephant and Castle, and you'll see it. It'll be on the left-hand side as we pass it, as we turn around this corner, and it is Spurgeon's Tabernacle, this house of worship, which is just in front of us on the left. And Spurgeon's Tabernacle on the left is where you had one of the first, if not the first, appearance of the Fisk Jubilee Singers in these islands. The Fisk Jubilee Singers from Fisk University, one of the historically black universities and colleges in the United States, Tennessee, who are here to basically raise funds for that institution. The way they raised funds was to introduce, as I call it what it was, they called it Negro spirituals to these islands for the first time. And they just knocked everybody out. The British public had never heard singing like this before, religious praise like this before, and they went on to tour successively around these islands and Europe. But they also performed for Queen Victoria. There's a famous portrait of them sitting down, having performed for the monarch, and they were massively successful. Some of them actually settled in Britain rather than going back to the United States, which is something a lot of entertainers did. Here you are on the left, the Metropolitan Tabernacle, Spurgeon's Tabernacle. I could talk about that forever, because some of us subconsciously still carry these tunes. Nobody knows the trouble of seeing Wade in the Water. I'm not going to sing them for you, but you know them already. Swing Low, all of that. Okay. We're going to go up towards the Imperial War Museum, but I just want to flag up very, very quickly as we do so. On the other side of Peronet House, it's out of vision. There's going to be a plaque erected on the 12th of April to Dr. Cecil Belfield Clarke, the Barbadian Dr. Cecil Belfield Clarke, who for decades, I think like 4 or more decades, was known as the Black Doctor of this part of, one of the many Black Doctors in the early to mid 20th century, who weren't simply GPs, they were also political activists. Cecil Belfield Clarke was a founding member of the League of Coloured Peoples, one of, if not the highest profile, black civil rights organizations in the 1930s, about who we might hear more later. But again, so many of these things, like the spirituals, are just part of our subconscious. We don't even know we know them, or they're part of us, where they came from. Those of us who have either as children been administered liquid medicines, or as adults have administered them to our own children, won't know that we're using the Clarke formula. The Clark formula was devised after Cecil Belfield Clark of Barbados. Basically, it's the formula, I think it's the weight to measures formula, by which children are dosed. But yeah, all these are just parts of us that we carry around, but we don't know where these things come from. So if you're around on the other side of this road system on the 12th, you can check on the Black History Walk's website. Do join us for the unveiling of a plaque to Dr. Cecil Belfield Clark.
And on that day, we're going to have Cambridge University, because he actually studied at Cambridge. They'll be coming down too. Plus, the British Medical Association will be there as well as the London Southbank University, because the site is actually on one of their premises. And we'll have, hopefully, a member of the Barbados government who are going to unveil this plaque to their kind of a very amazing favourite son.
Okay, on our left, we're just passing the Imperial War Museum, and it's a place that I've, as a freelancer, I have worked with and for them on a number of their projects and exhibitions looking at the black presence in the British Armed Forces, and most notably in the last war. In fact, tellingly, I'm going to go on a bit about this. Has anyone been following the story of Flight Sergeant Peter Brown? Flight Sergeant Peter Brown is he died in December last year alone, and the age of 96, going on 97, one of the last of the black air crew, those who flew in Bomber Command during the Second World War. Tragically, he died alone, and no family could be found. Solitary man, but the call went out for people to attend his funeral at originally Mortlake Crematorium. That date has been changed because there's just been an outpouring of well wishes and good feeling towards him and his memory. But I'm saying all this by way of prefacing the large numbers, up to 500 black men who joined the Royal Air Force as air crew, navigators, pilots, air gunners, etc. In the Second World War, bomb aimers, etc. Performing those most disturbing and worrying duties in a field of the armed services, an area of the armed services which lost more than 50,000 young men, mostly over the skies of Northern Europe. But we've also got the black presence in the British Army, which is hardly ever looked at. This goes back as well to the late 1600s. It particularly flourishes in the colonial period in the Caribbean with the raising of West India regiments. But most tellingly, as we are about to go over the water, we've got the black maritime presence, which is my favorite subject. The black maritime presence, the presence of black men, not just in the Royal Navy in very large numbers in the 1700s, early to mid 1800s, but also in the merchant fleets up until the 1940s. Absolutely fascinating set of people whose presence and settlements in the port cities of these islands, including London, was a great impetus to the black presence in Britain. But I haven't got time to go into these stories. Those of you who would like to know more, please join us on the river, join Black History Walks on the river for the boat tour, where I will be allowed to go into a lot more detail, granular, boring detail on that particular subject. But it's very, very important to flag up the longevity of the black presence, particularly in London. Okay, yeah, so we're going to be coming alongside on the right the Palace of Westminster, the Houses of Parliament in about 13 seconds, and of course those are the sets of buildings in which the abolition bills were signed and passed in 1807 and 1833-34. It's often forgotten though that as well as through the exertions of the Clapham sect, the Wilberforces, the Thorntons, etc. You also had black writers, black thinkers who were present and who were also pushing forward and agitating for an end to enslavement. One of the most, well, the highest profile really of them was Olaudah Equiano. How many have heard of Olaudah Equiano on the bus? Yes, Olaudah Equiano, who gave us, if we believe his account, the first account of being transported as property across the Atlantic as a child. He was actually baptized in this building on our left, St. Margaret's Church, as we turn the corner. It's right here, hard on the corner. If you're ever around here, go and have a look at the plaque to him. And he's described, interestingly, in the notes of his baptism as a young man from the Carolinas. That's something I might talk about later. But I want to talk to you about Nelson Mandela. See him on the right there? Right there, Nelson Mandela. Again, talking about black statues, there are very few, but he's got two of them. Not just one there, but also one on the South Bank. A bust of him, or a large head of him. But yeah, to jump back into Olaudah Equiano, he was one of a number of black writers in the 18th century, in the 1700s, who were doing extraordinary things, putting black thought into English and publishing for the first time. Very, very radical. As I said, he's not the only one. He's giving us an account of being trafficked from his own narrative. You also have the letters that were produced by Ignatius Sancho. Ignatius Sancho, I'm going to direct your attention to the left now, where you can see the sign saying the Cabinet Raw Rooms underneath the arches on King Charles Street on the hard left, just as we pass this corner on the left. He and his family lived down there, a very comfortable 18th century life. They had property of a value which entitled them to vote. His wife was, thank you Bus, his wife was a black woman who's described erroneously, I believe, as a West Indian woman, but she was actually, some people are saying she was born here, Anne Osborne. But even he, talking about himself as a man of property, as a man of leisure, as an educated man of influence and style, who's lived here all of his conscious life, he was brought here about 2 or 3 years of age, says that to the English, we are all either mulish or foolish without exception, and I'm only a lodger here, and hardly that. Okay, we're going to head up into Trafalgar Square. As we go, if you look straight ahead, you can see Nelson's column. And I want you to focus on the base of the column. Some of you will know what I'm going to be pointing out already, but you'll intuit it. Nelson's column illustrates the 4 principal victories of Admiral Horatio Nelson. And of course, we're looking, as we approach, at the Battle of Trafalgar, where he perished. And you can see Nelson's last moments on the flagship, the Victory. You can see Nelson's last moments on his flagship, the Victory. And this game that we're going to play, those of you who are on the left side of the bus will be able to play it better, unless this bus messes with us again. And the game is called Spot the Black Man. Yes, there is a black... Get into the habit. So once you get into this whole field, you will be playing this game for the rest of your life. My work is done. Okay, so look up into the base of this. Look up into the relief. It'll be on the left-hand side as we turn. You see left from Nelson's column. Look closely, look closely, look closely. You know, we're talking about black sailors who were there abundantly in Nelson's navy. And we're looking at a representation of Nelson's last moments of the Victory. You see him? Good. He's not wearing a hat unless he's wearing a wig. No, he's not. Definitely not wearing a hat, and he's definitely black. Isn't this interesting? I find this fascinating. I've had people stand in front of this for minutes upon minutes and they can't see him because, you know, we have not been trained to see the black presence in representations of black history, even when the person is standing in front of us holding a musket at the left of that composition, looking grimly into the melee. He's definitely there. Yeah, but we're always there. So please keep your eyes peeled. The black presence is everywhere in the built environment. And of course, what he does, of course, is symbolize the presence of black sailors, about whom we know a lot. And as I said, it's one of my areas of specialization. Their presence in the Royal Navy gave a lot of them freedom. More than freedom, gave a lot of them money, prize monies, and it gave them say, a career trajectory and status, because you had a lot of petty officers. You had even a black captain, Captain John Perkins in the Royal Navy, with a majority white crew. I'm sure a movie's going to be made about that soon. But so many stories. I should have said as well, Alauda Equiano, who we know mostly as a civil rights activist and a correspondent, a writer. He actually spent most of his life as a sailor in the Royal Navy and elsewhere. The black maritime presence is absolutely huge for obvious reasons. There's always a shortage of labour, and there's a superabundance of skilled black labour of all sorts. Okay, so we're heading into Theatreland along the Strand, and very soon on the left we'll be coming alongside the Adelphi Theatre. And the Adelphi Theatre was where in the 1820s, 1821, 22, you could have seen Billy Waters. You wouldn't have missed him. He was a one-eyed, one-legged, violin-playing black man wearing a pompous bicorn, sometimes tricorn hat, fiddling away and dancing and singing. He was not just a beggar, any beggar, he was the king of the beggars. And it's a serious thing in that time when you had such a large community or section of the population who had no money and no resource whatsoever. You can see it right now on the left, after the Nationwide Building, the Adelphi Theatre. And there has been a plaque to him that has been erected on Dyot Street in Covent Garden, where he lived, which is just upholding his memory. He died literally 200 years ago, this month in 1823. Okay, to the left, you can see the Savoy and the Savoy Theatre, and that was, sorry, to the right, excuse me, to the right you would have seen 8 seconds ago the Savoy Theatre, and that was where Paul Robeson performed in 1930 one of his sustained one of his roles as Othello. And this is quite radical if you think about it. Paul Robeson, the late great civil rights activist, athlete, lawyer, linguist, just man of parts and learning, the highest profile black person, apart from Marcus Garvey, in the early 20th century. He performed the part of Othello in London's West End in the 1930s, and this was radical because, you know, imagine a black man performing the part of a black man on the stage. And one of the things he had to do, of course, playing the part of Othello, the Moor of Venice, was to pour and rage around Desdemona. The object of his jealousy is imagined or real jealousy. And this shocked a lot of people because, you know, he is not just pouring any Desdemona, but Dame Peggy Ashcroft, with whom he was actually having a full-on affair. But the theatre-going public didn't know that, and some of them were shocked by these depictions, but others praised his portrayal of Othello, which is really interesting because that was almost 100 years after another African American, Ira Aldridge, first brought a black Othello to the London stage in Covent Garden to, you know, the same sort of judgment and prejudices. But interestingly, Ira Aldridge went on to become one of the great Shakespearean actors, Shakespearean delineators, and he was honoured in this country, but moreover throughout Europe, where he spent most of his career. And interestingly as well, one of Ira Aldridge's daughters went on to give Paul Robeson elocution lessons for his performances of Othello at the Savoy Theatre. Oh yes, Ira Aldridge's daughters lived and died here. There's a blue plaque, an English heritage blue plaque to him in Norwood. Yeah. Well, Ira Aldridge, let's say, had a very, 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 very complicated family life. I'm just going to leave it at that. Yeah, the bells of St. Clement Danes on the right, signalling our arrival into Fleet Street. The Church of St. Clement Danes on our right is the official church of the Royal Air Force, and I've got a sneaking suspicion that that is where the ceremony for Peter Brown, Flight Sergeant Peter Brown, who is passing, I mentioned earlier, might be transferred to. But yes, a lot of associations with Bomber Command and the black presence there as well. So we're heading into Fleet Street, which was the traditional home of Britain's newspaper industry. And what's often forgotten was that there was a fascinating set of histories around black publishing, independent, black financed publishing, most prominent of amongst which was the African Times and Orient Review, which was published from number 158 Fleet Street. The frontage has now gone, but we'll be passing the scene of it in a few moments. And the African Times and Orient Review was published in the early 1900s under the aegis of one fascinating, contradictory individual, Dusay Muhammad Ali, who was a black Muslim, if we believed he was who he said he was. Interesting person. And what it was exactly what it says on the tin. If you can just see close to this rental unit to let, it would have been somewhere on that site. The numbering has changed. And Dusay Muhammad Ali's periodical went all around the black world. It was published and financed by money from Sierra Leonean businessmen, and it criticized the colonial government. It was always, they were always trying to ban its distribution. Dusay Muhammad Ali at one stage had some office help, an office worker, well, that would be a young black man from Jamaica, who was desperately looking for work. The young black man was living on the other side of the river, over the bridge, where we can see on our right. We're going to pass it in a second. You can imagine that young black man taking the journey across the bridge and going up, cap in hand, looking for writing work, because he fancied himself as a writer and a political observer for Dusay Muhammad Ali, who only had little, basically, gopher jobs for him. That young man was none other than Marcus Mosiah Garvey in the year 1913. And Marcus Mosiah Garvey wrote the first published piece of political writing, The West Indies in the Mirror of Civilization. That was published by Dusay Muhammad Ali. Again, he's a fantastic character who lived the whole life of the Black Atlantic in Africa, West Africa, where he died, in what would become Nigeria, here in London and in North America. It's the stuff of, actually, no, I'm not going to say it's the stuff of movies, that's insulting him, but it's the stuff of just wonder, how several and seemingly complete his multiple lives and personalities, their multiple lives and personalities were. we're chugging up Ludgate Hill. Yeah. Talking about black beggars before we get to the beautiful St. Paul's Cathedral. Yeah, Ludgate Circus, Ludgate Hill was the site of Charles McGee, one of the famous black beggars of London. There were many. There were folk heroes because they were supposed to be good with money and funny and witty, but there were also folk devils because they were black. But this whole notion of the black beggar has just totally gone from London folklore and public memory. But yeah, of course, we're coming up to St. Paul's Cathedral. Those of you in the front will see it, and those of you in the left will have the best view. It was here in October 1958 that we could have seen Paul Robeson, the great Paul Robeson, one of the greatest artists all around, human beings of the 20th century. And he was appearing here in October 1958, basically to greet and thank his English supporters who had gathered to celebrate the fact that he had his passport returned to him by the United States government. A lot of his supporters here had lobbied for him to have his passport returned because he was seen to be a subversive and to be besmirching the name of the United States abroad and bringing shame onto that country and its citizens, when he's just speaking the truth to power. That October afternoon, he read from the lectern. He had a reading from the good book, and he also sang. There was money collected on behalf of South African activists and radicals, including Nelson Mandela, who was still standing trial at that time. So he never forgot his art, Paul Robeson, and he never forgot his politics. They were one and the same. It's really an interesting period of history. He illustrates when being politically active was synonymous with being an artist in many circles. Genuinely talking in a historical sense there. Also, I should have said before we leave Robeson, about whom we could do a whole tour, he spent some of his life in London, and when he was here in the 1930s, he made a couple of films. One was a real stinker called Sanders of the River, in which he plays an African chief by the name of Bosambo, and Bosambo is just one of these faithful, loyal Africans who is very supportive of the district commissioner, Sanders, the eponymous Sanders, who knows how to bring the tribes people under control by using the Gatling gun. And you know how that goes. Anyway, it was a shameful role for Robeson, and all sorts of black people who were living in London, the League of Coloured People, Marcus Garvey, they hated that movie and they let Robeson know. Robeson changed tune. In 1936, you saw the movie Song of Freedom, which came out, and Song of Freedom stars Robeson as John Nzinga. Excuse me. John Nzinga is a British-born black man. He's living in one of these riverside communities where you did have black people mingling with the majority communities. He's working on he's a dock worker, but he also has a sense of unbelonging. He never feels at home here. He feels he should be elsewhere, and he wants to go back to Africa. I'm not going to give you the plot, but I will always advise you to go to YouTube and watch the film for yourself. You will squirm because it's quite archaic and old-fashioned in some of its attitudes and approaches, but the message is so strong, and the solution to his problems of identity is also very strong and practical, and the music is top-notch. You can't go wrong with Paul Robeson. I'll just leave it at that. So as we continue our way through the city, I have to stress here that if you want to find out the deep history and its impact on us all, you just have to look at the connections of between the city and enslavement and the black presence. its roots are deep. We went round Clapham and just touched on the sugar and slave men, these newly flourishing millionaires like the Hibberts, the Beckfords, the Martins, the Greens, who didn't just hold seats in Parliament, they were successively directors and governors of the Bank of England and chairman of the Bank of England. £1 in 10 in circulation in the 1780s came just from Jamaican sugar alone. It's a huge, ugly story, and you know there is a Black History walking tour around the city when you can see how that all played out in human stories, black and white. Right, we're coming up to Tower Hill, Tower Bridge. Again, an area packed with stories. As we turn, again on a blink and you might miss it circumstance, you can, I'll try and point out the site where the last woman to be hung on Tower Hill met her death. The last woman to be hung at Tower Hill was by the name of Charlotte Gardner. There's actually a sign around Tower Hill which says that the last woman was hung here in the summer of 1780. It doesn't mention that she was actually a black woman, and she was hung as part of her involvement in the Golden Riots, and she was one of a number of black people who were hung for their participation in what were at first anti-Catholic riots, supposedly attacks on Catholic prestige, an imagined extension of civil rights to Catholics, etc., etc. After day 2, this being London, everyone forgot about religion. Just all the poor people just went out to get theirs and to get drunk. More than 200 people drank themselves to death. Upwards of this is London. Upwards of 600 died or were murdered during these riots. A disproportionate number of black people were sentenced to hang. Charlotte Gardner, for her participation, was hung by the neck until dead. On Tower Hill at a site I'll point out as the light turns, and she was the last woman to be hung. The men, interestingly, were given the choice either hang by the neck until dead or join the British Army. Fools! They joined the British Army and got sent out to West Africa to guard the slave forts. Can you imagine that as a fate for a black man? Some of you sound like you're considering it. No objection to that combination. But yeah, I read a lot of bad science fiction, and I just can't think of anything worse. You know, some of those men would have had horrific journeys to these islands and to go to Africa in the King's Red to guard the slave forts. What a thing. Anyway, yeah, so we're turning towards Tower Hill now. And you can see after this next set of lights on the left, there is the Merchant Seamen's Memorial, and it's just to the left, the first gate. That's where Charlotte Gardner was hung by the neck until dead. And interestingly, it was claimed in the court that she had been the leader of this attack on a pub, piling up everything that could burn, and of course getting drunk and stealing 2 golden candlesticks. Okay, you can see the little entryway here, the little gateway, the first gateway on the left, bang, that's where they would hang enemies of the state, and Charlotte died there. Right, the sharp-eyed amongst you will know that, recognize that on the right, we're passing the Tower of London. Black history is everywhere. Remember, let me take you back to the 1600s. Throughout the 1600s and 1700s, you had... Oh no, just right there. Yes, there should be, yeah, with this. There is, in the 1700s, you have a diverse community of black people. You have those who are broke, those who are poor, those who are struggling, those who are tradespeople, those who are business people, writers and intellectuals, but you still have people who have been bought, people whose lives are the property of others. And I'm going to show you a story from the Tower of London, which concerns a young man by the name of given name of Edward Francis. And you know a fair bit about him, because in common with a lot of young black men and women, young black boys and girls, as we say nowadays, teenagers, he took the most radical and empowering solution to his bondage, and that was to run away, to chart his own fate, to be master of his own destiny. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these stories. The reasons these young people can run away is because they can. There are supporters of runaways throughout Britain. There are also communities of black people and free black people in Britain, in London in particular. And of course, don't forget the Royal Navy, always, 9 times out of 10, unless there's an ulterior motive, will take able-bodied young people into their service. They'll turn a blind eye to a runaway such as this, Edward Francis. I'm just going to read from the newspaper extract describing him. It says, run away, and the year is 1687 here. Run away from the Tower, that's the Tower of London on the right, on the 30th of December last, run away from Mr. Thomas Dimmock at the Lion office in the Tower, a black boy with about £10 in silver and 1 guinea, a huge amount of money to be walking around walking around East London with in that period. £10 in silver and 1 guinea. He's aged about 16, wore 3 coloured coats, 2 grey, his uppermost cinnamon colour, lined with black, black shad facings on the sleeves, grey stockings, a silver collar about his neck, engraven Thomas Dimmock at the Lion office. Whoever shall apprehend him and bring him to the Lion office in the Tower shall have 2 guineas reward and charges borne. He speaks but bad English and has holes in both his ears. So, everyone can look for this boy because A, he's still got the collar on, and if they find him, they can get 2 shillings. And they're telling everyone that he's walking around with £10 in silver and 1 guinea. So he's like a walking cash machine. Win-win for whoever finds him. And I always ask people, I'm sure some of you have heard me go on about this case and others like this before. How many people think he actually got away scot-free? Oh, no. 21st century cynics, you're right. He didn't get away that time, and we know that he was returned to Thomas Dimmock, who I should have said was the keeper of the lions. He was the lion keeper. There used to be a whole tower in the tower complex where they kept lions. It was called the Lion Tower. And they kept a variety of Moroccan lion, which is now extinct. And obviously the African man was there to offset the glory of the king of the beasts. However, he's running away in the middle of winter and taking a lot of money with him. We know he was caught because he enters the public record a second time. And he enters the record a second time because he's back with the Dimmock family, and he's back trying to get his freedom, back to his old tricks. The first time he tries to get his freedom by running away. The second time, and yeah, here's another question for you. How do you think he tried to get his freedom the second time? Sorry? Buy it? No. There's a lot more direct action than... Someone say murdy? Yes, murder. He tried to poison the Dimmock family as they said. Who's laughed? Cackle. He tried to murder the family as they sat to dinner, because that was one of his roles, not just offsetting the glory of the quadrupeds, but also serving the family there. He was a household servant and unpaid. And he got some advice on the murder from a friend of his, another black man, young black man by the name of Tom, who lived very close to him in the Mint, which was almost part of the Tower complex, the Royal Mint. And Tom advised his friend, typical friend advice, to buy a half penny's worth of rat's bane, rat poison, to grind it up and to sprinkle it into the drink, the beer, and the gruel, the slops, that he would be serving the family as a meal. He did this. The whole family was violently sick for 4 days and nights. Violently sick. The mother, Dimmock's wife, she did die sometime after, and it's believed it could have been as a result, but she was poorly anyway, so we don't know. But the only member of the household that actually perished was the poor innocent cat. that went and licked the plate, and so the cat. I'm still laughing. The cat perished, and Thomas Dimmock, the lion keeper, took Edward Francis, a young black man, before Lord Lucas, the governor of the house, so the governor of the Tower of London, looking for punishment. And this is fascinating. This is really why I love these histories, because everyone, when questioned about the young man, said yes, he was surly, he was recalcitrant, and he was always trying to run away, didn't follow orders, etc. And he was always trying to upset the master. And when Lord Lucas questioned the young man himself, asking, did you poison the family intending to secure your own freedom? He says, yes. He actually says, yes, he did that. That's what it's about. So, yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, whenever you can. And yeah, did you try to murder the family to get your own freedom? And he said, yes. Oh, thanks. And what was really bizarre was that Lord Lucas decided that he would discharge the case and let the young man go. I don't know why. I cannot think why he would have done that, but that happened. But that's one of the reasons why I really, really love these histories, because it's always something that you would not imagine, all sorts of stories. But yeah, the stories of runaways I'm particularly fascinated with, because they're empowering, and they're stories of young people. And yeah, there's a huge amount of them as well, which are readily accessible. Remember, some of these young people are also writing stories about their lives. There's this huge library of material that we really have to fully appreciate. There was a question about it being against the law to teach and enslave people to read and write, not within Britain. And this is the ridiculous state of affairs that pertained at that time. Although it was discouraged and was punishable in the plantation systems across the seas in the Caribbean and in the British Americas, and later in the independent states, it wasn't the case here at all. It's so bizarre that it was in Britain, in the heart of the empire, in the belly of the beast, that this was a place where there was freedom, comparatively greater freedom of association, freedom of expression for black people. You have black people who are voters, black people who are property owners, black people of all statuses. It was very, very, very jumbled and incoherent. But of course, the vast majority of people would have been an underclass. And amongst them, you still had, as in the case of Edward Francis and others into the 1700s, people whose status was that of being the property of others. But yeah, why I'm excited about these young people's lives is that some of those, like Ignatius Sancho and Equiano and Otomacuguano, there were young people who left accounts of their lives and their opinions. And you can see again in the newspapers, you get accounts of who they were, what they did, where they came from. In public records, you can really get a good slice of the feel of their lives. I don't know if that answered your question, but long story short, it was not forbidden. There weren't all of those fatwas against association or where you could go, where you could live, marriage, etc. But of course, such people would not have been universally or even at all popular. The family, as far as I know, did not own human lives. Although it's entirely probable that they did. But to the best of my knowledge, William Wilberforce, although he was an extreme conservative on everything, now he's not about women joining the abolition movement, though they did. He wasn't that keen on ordinary white working class people organizing their labor. In fact, he's dead against it. Extreme conservative in everything apart from his drive to end slavery. I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, that his family had connections direct connections to the trade in human lives. No, I'd say that he didn't, but I'm sure if I looked even more deeply, he might have had maybe shares in cotton mills or something. It wouldn't surprise me, given how conservative he was in every other aspect of his life. Because remember, the abolition movement was the first across the board political movement in Britain's history. You didn't have a movement which involved people of all across classes and across genders as well. And Wilberforce, when he saw it, and he saw women joining up, even though they couldn't sign the petitions, but he saw women becoming activists, he understood that once women got their first political blood in the abolition movement, they'd go on to go for the vote, suffrage. And he was right. And he said, well, for women to meet, to publish, and to go from door to door whipping up petitions, these appeared to me, these proceedings appeared to me to be, proceedings appeared to be, I'm going to forget the quote, contrary to the conduct of women as outlined in scripture. So, yeah. Happy Sunday, everybody. So, yeah. Contrary to the role of women as outlined in scripture. That's it. Okay, so we're in this part of London, Southwark, by the river, the riverine Southwark, and moving towards the river, we would have caught a glimpse, or we could have caught a glimpse, and had you been on the boat trip, a better view of the remodelled Shakespeare's Globe, William Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, and very, very interesting site there, because a very interesting life, of course, Shakespeare had, because there are some authorities who are better qualified than I am who maintain that the mysterious dark woman, the Dark Lady, his love, that to whom William Shakespeare dedicated his sonnets, was in fact a black woman. And I'm not so sure. but I like the argument. I enjoy the argument because it gets up people's noses. And it's an interesting argument because the Shakespeare scholars draw my eye, my agnostic eye, to the fact that Shakespeare mentions in his sonnets, praising his lady love, about how her skin is dun, D-U-N, her skin is brown, and how her hair is like wires. And that doubly surprised me because I didn't know there were wires in 1609, but he talks about that. And he talks about how whiteness is yesterday's fashion, and how anything to do with lightness and fairness is now passed by under the light and power of his new lady love. I don't know if she was black, but there are some people who think they've actually found her. Someone who went masqueraded, to be accurate, under the name of Lucy Negro. And she was someone who existed in fact as well. She ran, you're all adults here, so she ran a knocking shop, I will say that, in Clerkenwell Green. Turnmill Street, used to be Turnbull Street. Anyway, long story short, some people think that was Lucy Negro. We don't know, but we do know that the places Shakespeare did go, such as Turnbull Street in Clerkenwell, we know there are a number of black men who were recorded as being their own properties. Okay, very quickly, we're going over Blackfriars Bridge. You can see the signs which have been put up by Black History Walks in memory of the 1981, 2nd of March 1981, the Black People's March, Day of Action, to commemorate the deaths, suspected murders by arson of 13 and ultimately 14 black teenagers at a house fire at number 439 New Cross Road. And the case is actually still open, but one of the results of that and the actions to force the police to take the claims of arson seriously, one of the outcomes was a march of up to 25,000, mostly young, mostly black people, all the way from, Londoners will know the distances I'm talking about, from New Cross Gate, across the bridge we've just crossed, down Fleet Street, which we're about to go down again, and to Hyde Park. And you can imagine the old canyon of Fleet Street we're going to go down, a canyon of all the old right-wing red-top newspapers and the racial epithets which were rained down on, on the marchers. You'll take the lift, yes please. And it also, it actually feels like, always say, it feels like something from another time to imagine young people making a walk taking a walk, moving for that length of period, upright, but also for doing it from politicized motives, from political motives. The largest public display of political action by black people, 1981. Okay. We're about to turn back onto Fleet Street. There's a whole. I've done pieces of writing on, the black press. I've spoken about the African Times and Orient Review, Hussein Mohammed's organ. Also, you had, the African Telegraph. You could go back to the 1817 and the first issues of Robert Wedderburn, who is actually the only hero I have in any of these histories. Robert Wedderburn's Axe Laid to the Root. Robert Wedderburn was probably one of the most radical people from British history. Jamaican, born of mixed background, settled here as a tailor, then became an all-out blood and fire radical. Check out, if you can, the edition number 3 of the Axe Laid to the Root, published and written by Robert Wedderburn. He prints and publishes the first page, so a quarter of the first page, just in pure patois, pure Creole. He publishes, and the reason why he does it is for two audiences. One audience is the audiences here, not just the black audiences here who read and understand it, but the fact that the white audiences would also be able to understand it. One of the parts of history which is so obvious and so forgotten is that given the large black population here, black speech and black terminology and patois slang has entered the English language by ordinary people. If you read popular fiction of that time, you can see that it's entered the popular language. There's actually a dictionary of the vulgar tongue, Gross's Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, which shows how many words of black origin and African origin have entered the language, etc. So Robert Wedderburn is writing for two audiences, one black, one white, and of course he's writing for another audience, which is the enslaved on the plantations in the Caribbean. And his publication, like Dussé Muhammad Ali's a century later, would also be policed by the government, particularly the colonial government in Jamaica, because Robert Wedderburn he was not Equiano. He was not talking about, yes, we are all one flesh under the body of Christ, etc., etc. He was talking about basically killing, murder, fire, blood, and he was not apologizing for it at all. I should have added that he was completely insane, but you also have to read his writings just to get a sense of the power and focus of the man. Very, very interesting person, very, very interesting life.
One, two. This is Fleet Street, and when that Black People's Day of Action marched down in 81, it was the headquarters of all the national newspapers, and those journalists were in windows spitting on, doing Nazi salutes towards, and racially abusing that march. So as people came down the street in their thousands, the newspapers of the time were harassing them and racially abusing them. So that was a climate of the black population in the 80s, that the newspapers were so hostile that even their journalists were coming out there giving right-wing Nazi salutes, spitting on them and calling them all the names in the sun. So you can then imagine how anything to do with black people was portrayed in those newspapers if the journalists were out here giving Nazi salutes, which is what the situation was. And as we go towards Trafalgar Square, just say briefly, Trafalgar Square was the center of the anti-apartheid protest movements. You'd have up to 10, 20,000 people down there on a regular basis up until 1990 protesting against apartheid, and that was the place where you'd go to sign a petition against apartheid. So for our South African friends on board the bus or ship or whatever it is, right, just remember when you go past Trafalgar Square, that was the center of support for the South Africans fight for freedom. And I should also mention this very briefly, just check out a guy called Wouter Basson. Just check out a guy called Wouter Basson. Spell his name for you. His name is spelled W-O-U-T-E-R, W-O-U-T-E-R, last name is Basson, B-A-S-S-N. So Wouter Basson was the head of the South African Chemical and Biological Warfare Division, and his job as a scientist was to find out ways to kill black people using drugs and diseases, and he was funded by the South African government up until 1990 when Mandela comes out of prison. But just check out Wouter Basson, W-O-U-T-E-R, B-A-S-S-O-N. He was called, nickname was Dr. Death. He was on trial South Africa in the mid-90s. He was found not guilty, even though he had evidence from his own staff saying he was trying to kill black people en masse. And right now, the last time I checked, he gives lectures, motivational speeches around the world, and he's still a doctor. Dr. Wouter Basson, W-O-U-T-E-R, B-A-S-S-O-N. Sounds unbelievable, but just check out his name, Wouter, W-O-U-T-E-R, Basson, B-A-S-S-O-N, and see what you think about him.
So we're just having left Fleet Street. For those of you who are here as visitors, I strongly recommend that you take a personal stroll down Fleet Street back towards Ludgate Circus, St Paul's, and dip into the little side streets and ruelles and twisting wines on the left-hand side of Fleet Street, and you'll come across the home of Samuel Johnson. Dr. Samuel Johnson, some of you might be familiar with him as Britain's first lexicographer, dictionary compiler, who Well, actually, he's a weird man. I'm not going to go into it, but he was very much against enslavement, and amongst his domestic staff was one Francis Barber. Francis Barber, who'd been brought here at the age of 14 from the island of Jamaica, and he was working as a free person for Francis Barber as his servant. He became not just a servant and a friend to Francis Barber, but also his confidant, and closest confidant, I should say. So much so that when Dr. Johnson died in 1784, he made his black manservant and friend Francis Barber his main legatee. Francis Barber got the bulk of his inheritance, of what he left behind, sorry. And on one condition, that Francis Barber leave London, because he was known for being a bit of a ladies' man and a bit of a gambler. So in order to come into this inheritance, Barber had to leave London and settle in Staffordshire, out in the sticks, and stay there. And he did that with his family. His wife Betsy was a white English woman, and they settled out there. And they eventually opened a little school to make a living there. But what's interesting is that their descendants are still living in the same county of Staffordshire. And I've met one of the descendants, Dennis Barber, and you can actually see a resemblance, a family resemblance. It's all the more interesting because Dennis Barber is he's white, basically. And the thing is that the Barber family are aware of their illustrious black ancestor, but it's a whole stream of inquiry in the family history industry now is looking for black ancestors, finding out who these people are in the family tree called Juba, who these people are, and how come they're being baptized as fully grown adults. But it's typically, I would say it's a typically British response to black history, that it may be the case that so much black history will re-enter the mainstream through white family histories. Yeah, there's that. So there are all sorts of issues around that. But the figure that was given for the number of ostensibly white people who, if they could trace their ancestry back to the 18th century, would have an ancestor of African heritage, is 1 in 5, which in a perfect world means nothing at all. But in the world that we're increasingly heading into, where identity, origins, prefigure almost everything, yeah, it's interesting stuff, I think you'll agree. Oh, yeah, we're passing Charing Cross station, and the actual cross, you can see the Charing Cross monument standing just in the forecourt of the station on the left. And that was the area where you could have seen in the 1800s, 18 and 1700s, human curiosities of all sorts. You have to remember that there was a long, vigorous tradition of having exhibitions of human curiosities, small human zoos. I'm trying to look for a euphemism, there isn't one. And amongst them, you could have seen at that site George Grattan, the piebald boy. He's an infant who actually died being used in that practice. And he's called a piebald boy because he suffered from vitiligo, you know, the uneven pigmentation of the skin, and people would pay to look at the child. And yeah, he actually died, I think, less than 5 years old, in Marlow in Buckinghamshire after that usage. More famously was Saatchi Bartman, the Hottentot Venus, who was brought over in the early 1800s, basically to be gawked at because of her backside, and people would walk around her, prod her at a site in close to Piccadilly Circus, and she was greatly abused and treated basically like an animal. And ultimately there was some brouhaha, including by black people living in Britain, against her abuses, and she was taken to Paris and subjected to the like corruption, and worse, she was actually prostituted, and she died of a number of diseases and conditions, including syphilis, and further injuries and insults, including her body remaining in France until I think the early 2000s, when it was returned to South Africa, finally for something resembling a humane burial.
You're on the right-hand side, you're at the back of South Africa House. So South African people, that whole block there at the front, that's South Africa House, and that's where we had all the demonstrations against apartheid in the 1990s, and that's where you'd come to sign a petition against apartheid. At the very front there, it was the longest 24-hour picket in history was taking place outside the South Africa House, and that's where you come to sign a petition to kind of support the ANC accepting Nelson Mandela. And that statue, I mentioned Wouter Basson because Wouter Basson was a regular guest here. So Wouter Basson, the guy who was in charge of the chemical biological weapons division in South Africa, was actually coming here as a guest on a regular basis, but also he was hosted in Germany and America and of course Britain. So his behavior in South Africa with the research into how to kill black people was actually supported by other European powers like Germany and of course America. Other than that, we saw a statue of Nelson Mandela in Parliament Square. It was supposed to be in this square, supposed to be in Trafalgar Square. That was the whole idea of it in the first place. But in 2007, when they had the idea to kind of put up the statue of Nelson Mandela, they had to get permission from the local authority, which is Westminster Council, and they said no to a statue of Mandela because they said that it would block traffic and it was too big and would look out of place in Trafalgar Square. Now, that is interesting, but basically that's how come it's not here, because Westminster Council objected to it. And I can tell you that Westminster Council in the 90s was known, and early 2000s was known for its reason, because there's a woman called Shirley Porter. She was the lead of the council. She actually was fined something like £40 million for vote rigging, which is to say that when she was the leader of the council, she would move out black or suspected Labour voters from her boroughs, or her wards rather, and then replace them with potential Conservative voters. And she was actually found guilty of that and fined something like £40 million. She only paid like £12 million after going on the run to Israel. So there's a huge story with regard to this area and the erections of, as Steve would call it, street furniture. But that statue of Mandela at Parliament Square, it should have been right here in this square, because this is a square where people came to support South Africans. This is why it's literally full of that history. And of course, Steve can mention a bit about Lord Nelson and his proclivities.
I'd rather not talk about what he did in my parents' homeland of Antigua. It's got a dockyard for something. But I just want to talk a little bit more about the Black Maritime presence, because it underpins pretty much everything that I'm talking about. Remember as well, people, the Royal Navy didn't just accept runaways, it also accepted skilled runaways, particularly people who are carpenters. Runaways from the island of Barbados in particular were very, very popular. Many of them ended up settling here as pensioners, as Greenwich pensioners, having a pension, living in quite palatial surroundings as well. Those of you who are visitors here, I strongly recommend that you visit Greenwich and have a walk around the Maritime Museum, Greenwich Park, and have a look at the Naval Hospital as well, the Old Royal Naval College, and you can see the conditions under which, quite palatial conditions, in which hundreds and hundreds of black sailors would have spent their last days. Okay, we're going to go back down Whitehall. As we go down it towards Parliament Square, I want to take you back to the early 1500s, back to 1511, a winter's day in 1511, when you could have seen festivities and jousting all down this thoroughfare, all the way down to Parliament Square, where we'll turn left to go back over the river. And there's festivities and jousting and merrymaking and feasting, because there's been a son born to the King, Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. This child will die, and but but there is sorry, Henry VII, I can't anyway. The child will perish shortly, but the feasting, which is and merrymaking on what's now Parliament Square, would have featured a particular individual, a black man, a very visibly black man, and he's represented as such by the name of John Blanc or John Blank, and he was known as the Black Trumpeter to King Henry VII and King Henry VIII. And if you Google John Blanc, B-L-A-N-K-E, and obviously the linguists amongst you will know it's a joke against his name and his colour, John White, calling him Chalky or something, and we know a lot about him. We know that he was not enslaved because he didn't just have regular monies, good monies from the king. He actually lobbied the king for more money, and he got it. So he must have been a favourite because the king also gave him, as a wedding present to a local lass, gave the couple some very expensive fabrics and material. He had money for the upkeep of his livery, but yeah, if you Google John Blank, B-L-A-N-K-E, you know, you can see a depiction of him, and it's not even a case of spot the black man. He's just quite clearly there, non-white amongst his fellow royal trumpeters. But for my own interest, that's where I start my histories and fascinations, because he's there in the court records, he's there depicted pictorially in the roll from the College of Arms. We know he existed. So yeah, my interests in the presents are from 1500s onwards, even though we do know that there were people of African origin, and they're continually being found in skeletal form who were here during the period of the Roman occupation. But beyond the bodies, we really know very little about these people. Actually, I should start my next bit of spiel now, because we're going to go over Westminster Bridge back across into South London. And I was talking about, remember we passed the statue of the Bronze Woman. So I mentioned that there's very, very few little statuary to black women in London. But we're going to pass, as we go across the river, just on the other side of the Thames. You'll see it as we hit the other side of the river, and I'll instruct you to look right into the grounds of St Thomas's Hospital. We're going to pass the site of probably the highest profile black woman in British history. Guesses, people? Bingo. Mary Seacole. Mary Jane Seacole. Born Jamaica, 1808. We believe to a Scottish father and a Jamaican black mother. And her mother ran a hostelry for officers in the British Army, and she would also practice as a traditional healer, a doctoress, as Mary Seacole styled herself. Mary Seacole's an interesting and controversial character. I think she's absolutely fascinating but questionable character, which makes her all the more interesting, because here you have a woman who made her way as a healer. We're given to understand that she's a healer. She's a sort of like mammy loving figure who went all around Central America and sailed again across the Atlantic to join her boys, as she called the soldiers in the Crimea, and to mop their fevered brows and to apply all of these herbally based poultices, blah blah blah. We keep forgetting that Mary Seacole wasn't just this mammy figure at all. She was a businesswoman. I'm going to direct you in a minute to look at the fantastic, and it's genuinely fantastic, look at this heroic image of her striding out. You can see it coming up on the right behind the circular backing. You can see the circular backing on the right. Is that a yes, people? Okay, and there's Mary Seacole with her bag of poultices and herbs and just goodness. And they're not forgetting that she probably had a few thousand quid in that bag as well. She was a business. Why is it that there's this discomfort with the idea of Mary Seacole as a business person and not this, what do they say? Gentle face with its tender, gentle face with its tender trace of a smile so wry. As she was described in one poem, a toast for Mrs. Seacole. But yeah, that's how she's come down to us. We have to remember as well, she was always making money. She didn't just come over to look after her boys and to tend to their wounds. She also came over to check on her investments in a gold mine. Okay? She was about her business. She was about her business. And when she died, I should have said as well, she also had a horrible relationship, the young people will say, beef with Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp, who, remember at the time, Mary Seacole had the higher profile than Florence Nightingale. It was only after the war that the lady with the lamp, Florence Nightingale, she took a rightful position because, she was a hospital reformer whose benefits, we all take from. Yeah. Oh, clip. So, and long story short, Mary Seacole died, leaving £2,500 in 1881, and she left it to people who didn't sound as if they needed it. The family of the Countess of Gleichen and Lord Rokeby, one of the divisional commanders of the Crimea. Okay, on our way to Vauxhall, we're going to pass on the left the grounds of Lambeth Palace. Lambeth Palace, connected of course to the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Church of England, the Bishop of London. You can see it here on the left as we pass. Its first links with black history that I'm interested in are from 1669, where we see in this building to our left here the baptism of one John. He's described as John, the son of Abimelech, good biblical name, Abimelech Potter, a blackamoor. That word again, always using that epithet, a blackamoor. And so Abimelech Potter, the blackamoor, is having his son baptized here. Now there's so much baptism going on, it's incredible, especially given the status of the Church of England, which was fully foursquare behind buying and selling of people, and used the Bible to justify it, as why wouldn't they? It's there. And this movement of black people into these churches can't just be explained by a need for praise and worship, or even community. You noticed in the first instance I gave of the black woman at Brixton Causeway, who's being looked after by her parish, because she's known to the parish. She's a member of a congregation, obviously. But for people who were not, particularly women who were members, who were not members of congregations, as in the case of Sarah Polston in 1799, and others, I should have mentioned that earlier in this, but I was running my mouth in another fashion. Sarah Polston and others, we have to assume that they suffered and their children perished because they were not members of a congregation. They weren't known to the congregation as well. And we miss looking for the black presence. We miss a lot of people simply because once they are known to the parish, no one talks about them as being black or being the African or as being the blackamoor. They're just known by their names. They just become local, as is the London fashion. So we're going towards Vauxhall now, and on our left, this whole stretch of ground from our left, on our left is would have been part of the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens. And the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens was a place of entertainment, feasting, music, and all sorts of other less praiseworthy distractions. Real nastiness happened there actually. But amongst its visitors, you saw in the 1770s Ignatius Sancho. Remember Ignatius Sancho, the writer, the composer, Ignatius Sancho, the black voter, Ignatius Sancho, the shopkeeper in the heart of Westminster in Whitehall, just off Whitehall. He gives us an account of how he, in one of his letters, or how he took his family down here to the site on the right, Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, for a family day out, a black family day out, during which they were subject to all sorts of racial abuse. One idiot jumped up on the running board of the coach they were in and basically mooned and farted into the carriage. Yeah, shocking stuff. But he delivers it in a very joking style. I should have said as well, for those of you who are on the left-hand side of the vehicle, you'll be able to see as we're making the next turn right. If you look left at ground level, there's actually a signage for Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens in memory of it. The Pleasure Gardens is where you can also see in 1848 someone from North America, a black man from North America, born free in Rhode Island by the name of William Henry Lane. And he performed under the name, not William Henry Lane, but Massa Juba. And Massa Juba, as I like to say, performed a sort of crossover act, that being his upper body was locked in the Irish style of dancing, the elbows firmly to the waist, and his lower limbs, his legs, were just going left, right, everywhere. Charles Dickens gives us a description of him. But he's responsible for a lot of bad things in this country, I would say, because with his arrival and his depictions of his notions of African American being and entertainment, he is described as a true son of, what did he say? A true son of the sable clime, which doesn't even make sense. With his appearance here in 1848, he sets in motion in this country the fashion, the insatiable appetite for minstrelsy, blackface minstrelsy, and the fashion of white artists putting black grease paint onto their faces in their depictions of Negro delineation, cooning, to give it its period term. And you remember, in this country as well, this was just so popular in the mid to late 1800s and all the way up until the 1970s on terrestrial television. Anyone else old enough to remember after the wrestling on Saturday? Yes, the black and white minstrel show. Yes. And again, I direct the younger people on this vehicle to YouTube, and you can see that there. Steady yourself, that's all I'm going to say to you. Shocking stuff. Oh yeah, Brixton had its own minstrels as well. Not just its own minstrels, it had its police minstrels. Brixton Police Minstrels. And they perform every year at the Canterbury, the old police pub, which has been knocked down. And they made money for charity. And the whole Metropolitan Police Minstrels, they closed down in 1930s, 1933, I believe. But yeah, ugly, vigorous histories. Also, you saw bouts of fisticuffs and fighting of all sorts happening there, manly contests, and you could have seen Bill Richmond in the early 1800s at the Pleasure Gardens. And Bill Richmond was the first of a number of black contenders for British boxing titles. These boxing titles that Bill Richmond contended for were bare knuckle boxing. Exactly what it says on the tin. Brutal, bruising, bloody, nasty rounds, up to 30 rounds of just punishing rounds of just suffering and inflicting suffering. And boxing of that sort was seen as being a uniquely British thing, a unique marker of British masculinity. So of course, when you see black contenders, a shock goes through the whole sport. On 2 occasions against the national champion Tom Cribb, Bill Richmond loses, but he pockets his winnings and opens the pub, the Horse and Dolphin, one of a number of black pubs, or in other areas I can bore anyone on. There are a number of black pubs throughout the British Isles and London, and he opens the Horse and Dolphin, which was one of the most lavishly appointed public houses in London. And indeed, there's going to be a plaque, Black History Walks plaque, on that site just behind the National Gallery. Sorry? Okay, could you... Yeah, so, after Bill Richmond, you see his protege, Tom Molyneux, another African-American, as we now say, boxer, who is being trained by Richmond. Because Richmond, in a sense, he wants his revenge against Tom Cribb. Bronze woman on the right again. We've got another closer eye-level look. Yeah, so Richmond wants his revenge against the boxer who beat him, Tom Cribb, and he trains up Tom Molyneux to get that revenge. Molyneux is totally different from Richmond. Richmond is a bit of a gentleman, he's literate, he's quite laid back, yeah, and he's a bit of a businessman. He also has a butcher's shop as well as the public house, and unfortunately Tom Molyneux, being too much of a lad and a drunkard, doesn't manage to hold up the dignity of the side. And interestingly, Bill Richmond became friends with his old spar and enemy, Tom Cribb, and he actually spent the last night of his life in his old enemy's pub, which still stands a few meters walk away from where the Horse and Dolphin used to stand. We have very interesting histories.
Yeah, we're going to head down towards Peckham now, but as we head down towards Peckham, we're going to go past Brixton Police Station. For those of you not from London or from England, just check out the history of Brixton. We could do a whole hour just in the police station, because when it comes to the deaths of young black men in police custody, Brixton, you could say, leads the way. I'll give you one name to check out. Check out the name of Sean Rigg. The name is spelled S-E-A-N-R-I-G-G. So Sean Rigg, S-E-A-N-R-I-G-G, died in custody in Brixton Police Station, and there was a massive campaign to get justice for this young man who was arrested fit and healthy and then died in the police station. The police said there was no video evidence, and then next thing you know, there was video evidence. The police said that he was not in a particular area, and then the video evidence really was in a particular area. So there was a mass amount of kind of cover-ups, deceits, lying basically by the police. And this is a situation which is still ongoing now when it comes to people like Chris Cabba, who actually was shot by police just recently. So much as you might hear about what happened in America with regard to Black Lives Matter, we have similar issues in the UK. And one example, the guy who died in Brixton was a guy called Sean Rigg, S-E-N-R-I-G-G.
The answer is no. Tony, do you want to take this one? Yeah, we'll go straight ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, the long story short, the history when it comes to schools is not taught. This history which sits on this bus is not taught in schools on the whole. There's a book came out just like a year before last called Pearson's Migration Book, which I am an author on, and that book is part based on the Notting Hill Walk. So we took the history having Notting Hill, the Black history of Notting Hill, made it into a GCSE exam textbook. So now that is being taught in schools across the country, but that's only since the last year and a half ago, right? So when it comes to primary schools, you don't have that sort of information unless the teachers teach it, which on the whole they don't do. So there's a lack of interest and resources for the history, but there's been some changes made with regard to that GCSE textbook, but also the fact that we're doing this sort of thing, and adults are then going back to their employment places and speaking about what they've learned on these tours and the walks that we do. So there's a kind of a ongoing move. In fact, we met at the Black Cultural Archives, and And that place goes back to the 1980s when a guy called Len Garrison said what you just said just there, that there should be this history being taught in schools and also be part of the kind of general awareness. So he actually organized, fundraise, and as a result of his activity, you now have the Black Cultural Archives, which has been there for what, almost 8 years now, and that's like the central point for archiving this history and learning about this history. So there's an ongoing struggle here, just like you find in America, when it comes to having these stories told and embraced by the mainstream. But this is what we're doing in this buster right now.
Yeah, and I'd add to that as well. It's really positive, I believe, that rather than look to the mainstream or look to the authorities, a lot of the activism around this and meaningful action like street signage and discussion is taking place at community level and at black organizational level as well. So there's a lot of more meaningful initiatives rather than looking for subsidies or other parties to tell these stories, which are really community property.
So I guess I'm also wondering then, like on that park, you know, where they had all the statues at, there was a statue.
Yes.
I also noticed the statue across the street with Abraham Lincoln, and some other things. So my question is, you have all these statues around the moment. They just exist. No, they're not talked about. They just put up a statue and hope somebody goes and reads it, or
Basically, yes.
Okay.
That's how it goes. You'd be surprised how many people don't even know Mandela statues there. You know, that whole thing of looking for the black presence in the built environment, there's some sort of struggle with that. A lot of people really, a lot of us, you know, black people, we struggle with that as well. So, yeah, it's about activities such as the one we're involved in now, making central and sacred this whole establishing the black presence in the landscape. It's really, really vital. Okay, so you can see this ugly building in front of us here, the barrier block, genuinely ugly building, but now barely affordable apartments. That was the site of the old nest of streets, which included Somerleyton Road, Geneva Road, where the initial Windrush arrivals who were living in Clapham South, they would come down all the way down to here, this part of London, to get basically their dole money and also to look for work. But rather than walking all the way back to Clapham, they started settling in the houses in and around here. And as you can see by the presence of this brutal piece of architecture, a lot of those properties and all the memories and histories and stories around the people who live there have just vanished. But yeah, little by little, bit by bit, we're trying to repopulate all of those stories and places. Okay, we're going up on Cold Harbour Lane towards colourful Camberwell and on to Peckham. And I want to flag up before we get there a house of worship. And it's a living reminder of one of, in fact, the oldest Pentecostal church in this country. And it was a Pentecostal church started by, let me be polite here, a very versatile Ghanaian man of God by the name of Thomas Brem Wilson in the early 1900s. Thomas Brem Wilson described himself as a mercantile merchant, as a ship's chandler. He wasn't really, he was doing all sorts of bits and pieces, doing all sorts of things, which, it being Sunday, I'm not going to go into. But he restyled himself as a man of God, and he was the person who brought Pentecostalism to the British Isles in the forms of worship, speaking in tongues, hyperventilating, having asthma attacks, all that sort of stuff. He brought that to these islands, and it was seen as a shocking thing. It's happening in South London, first on East Street, and then in Peckham, where we're going. And this church, because this was happening in the 19-teens up until the 1930s while he was still alive, because it was a lot of laying on of hands and a lot of young white women going there to have the hands laid on. You know where this is going. And a lot of secret meetings with the pastor, blah, blah, blah. A lot of, hey, and I don't know if to join up the dots here, but the black man's church, as it was called, kept shifting and shifting and shifting until it arrived on the corner just after the bridge we're going to go under. We're going to go under a bridge, and if you look to the right, you'll see a fairly new church, and it's still the black man's church. But it's now masquerading under a name, which I'm reaching for. I'm not managing to find. Okay, so going on the bridge. Yep, Shoreway International Ministries. You can see it there. Shoreway International Ministries. That's a direct descendant of the black man's church from the early 1900s. Thomas Brem Wilson, his diaries have surfaced, and let me just say that he had a very, very varied and active life, and being a pastor was just one of his many, many, many activities and associations. But yeah, we pass these places all the time, and we just forget that their impact on us is, we often forget where the built environment comes from. It's one of my big things. Okay, so we're going to go towards central Camberwell, and central Camberwell was a place of music, was one of the centres of the music hall, British music hall tradition. And music hall, apart from the straight up, excuse my language, cooning and minstrelsy, had a lot of stars, often black performers, black stars. In 1902, 1903, you could have seen performing at the Camberwell Palace of Varieties, and the site is really sad, it's just a flower shop now. Part of the site is now a flower shop. At the Camberwell Palace of Varieties, you could have seen Belle Davis, Miss Belle Davis and her pickaninnies. Yeah, Belle Davis and her pickaninnies. And Belle Davis was featured as the world's leading, and I kid you not, coon cantatrice. The world's leading coon cantatrice. And her pickaninnies, well, these poor kids, and they were kids. They went all around, not just the British Isles, but continental Europe, going to Russia and everything, grinning and soft shoe shuffling and tap dancing and just being abused, I would say. And often, when she lost one or two of them through illness, or they had to stay somewhere else, she'd just get another, because there are other black children, who could be used and in the same practice. But yeah, Belle Davis was massively, massively popular, as were other black performers on a higher status that we'll see later on. And yeah, the Palace of Varieties was just on the right here. You can see the Nunhead Gardener on the right, Orpheus Street on the right, the Nunhead Gardener on the right, just here. That whole complex was the Palace of Varieties. But we have to say though, that this whole area of music hall, minstrelsy, was a place of work and some sort of status for lots of black people who also lived all up and down the Brixton Road in the 1900s in performers' digs. A lot of work's going on now with local history societies about all of these performers, where they came from, what they did, what happened to them, and how many of them, particularly the African American performers, who ended up staying here and making their homes in Great Britain. Yes, Belle Davis and her pickaninnies. Okay, some of you will see a church steeple in the distance. That's the church steeple of St. Giles, Camberwell, the oldest church in Camberwell. And it is that site, not the actual church, but the site where the church has always stood on, there's a lot of black history locked up in there. I mean, this is one of the outskirts of London, and just by way of demonstration, the black history here goes back to 1604. I mean, baptized in 1604 and buried there. I think the year later, 1605, was one John Primero, and John Primero was a young man who was a household servant. We don't know his status, which is actually waged or unwaged. We don't know. But, he's already there. He's being baptized. He's becoming a part of the community here. And he's the earliest sign, almost 400 years ago, of in Camberwell. So I'm just mentioning him by way of flagging up the longevity and the ubiquity of black people and the whole black presence, which you could also have found in the Camberwell workhouse, which I will point out in a short while.
Just another quick comparison for the Americans. You guys in America have something called stop and frisk, especially in Europe. You have something called stop and frisk. Over here we have something called the sus law. Now the sus law was a law up until the mid-80s, and the sus law, let me say this very slowly, the sus law meant that if I, as a police officer, saw you walking on the street and I suspected that you might commit a crime in the future, I could arrest you. I'll say it again slowly, right? So the sus law allowed an officer up until the mid-80s that if they saw you walking on the street and they suspected that you might commit a crime in the future, they could arrest you, and that's what they did. And it meant that, for example, you have boys in uniform who are going to school at a bus stop who'd be arrested and assessed and taken to police station and left there. They wouldn't tell their mothers or fathers either. So that's part of the story. The other part is that at this time, officers will often plant evidence on you. So they'll pick you up, they'll plant evidence on you, which means you can get prison sentence for a year, 2 years, 10 years, etc. because of stuff you never did at all. And that affected the black community on a massive scale. That's quite a part of the fact that if they didn't actually convict you for what you had in the first place, they would beat you up. So Brixton, Carter Street, Notting Hill, Harrow Road were known for beating people up, right? When I say beat people up, I'm talking about you would have your head flushed down the toilet. You'd be in the cell, you'd have 6 officers would come in and beat you up and punch you, kick, etc. I'm talking about how they would drag you down the stairs by your feet when you're handcuffed. So you think about that, you're handcuffed, you're being dragged down the stairs with your feet, means your head's bounced off the steps. That's what life was like in the UK up until at least the 80s. And of course, if you watched news just last week, we heard that the police have been found not guilty, but they're found to be institutionally racist, sexist, and homophobic. And you had several officers who were actually raping women while in uniform. So massive history here when it comes to police in the black community, but that's just a little sample of it. And if you want more information, you can check out the various books and our websites because the information is actually out there. It's just a question of accessing it. Now we're going to end. Oh, hang on, let me pass that, Steve.
Okay, so we're edging from Camberwell, multi-ethnic Camberwell, into Peckham. And Peckham being one of the epicenter actually of African London, Little Lagos, some may call it. And this again is an area with a lot of black histories. On the corner we're about to pass was one of the sites where the Fisk Jubilee Singers also performed during their 1873 visit at Hanover Hall. It's unsigned, and there's no signage there. As we go further on, I might as well start talking about this now. The whole black performers on the British stage in the early 1900s thing. Similarly to what's happening in the United States, and a lot of these performers came from the United States, in order to have a high billing, a high profile as a black male performer, you had to satisfy and fulfill the appetites for minstrelsy. And of course, the normal appetite for minstrelsy was fulfilled by having a white male entertainer burning the cork and daubing the cork or the black grease paint onto their faces and going into the full Negro delineation, getting possessed by the spirit of Rastus and talking about watermelons and Alabama and plantations and all of that stuff. And in order to satisfy the tastes of majority audiences, the black performers had to do the same thing, a lot of them. So you have the black man pretending to be a white man, pretending to be a black man. I hear silence. No, it doesn't make sense, but it is true. So, well, it does make sense, but it's disgusting. So the black performer would have to put on the black paint, the burnt cork, in order to resemble a white performer who would also be doing the same on other stages to be a minstrel. Now, whilst this was humiliating, it's something that a lot of performers had to do in order to get the billings. And the more successful the performer, the more that was expected. And here we are in Peckham. This set of buildings on left and right, or set of sites on the left and right, rather than the actual buildings, was another location for, they call it one of these valleys of the comedians, where you'd have lots of music halls. And if the traffic moves, we're going to go past the site of the old Gaumont Theatre. And the Gaumont Theatre was where, in 1904, you could have seen the highest profile black performers in the world perform their hit musical called In Dahomey. Dahomey spelled as in the country, D-A-H-O-M-E-Y. In Dahomey. And the writers and performers were black, all black cast, all black choreography, black libretto. I think Paul Laurence Dunbar, the poet, had some hand in this strange performance. And yeah, as I said, you know, there were African Americans, although I think Mr. Williams had some Caribbean connection. And this performance of In Dahomey was a hit. When I say a hit, they toured and toured and toured their legs off. They were all over the British Isles incessantly for decades afterwards, doing these performances around the idea of returning to Africa, African Americans going back to Africa. But of course, if you just Google Walker and Williams In Dahomey, you'll see exactly what I mean. Because I think Burt Williams, you know, he applied the blackface himself, and he just played the part of the bumbling buffoon, the incoherent rhythmic idiot who didn't know Dahomey from whatever. But it was massively popular. Started off in London's West End, performed around the provinces, and was also for a brief while here in Peckham. And yeah, Peckham was also a place where you had a growing black population. Peckham, right here where we are, was where you had some of the first iterations of, you know, Thomas Brem Wilson's church, which is now Shoreway Ministries International. Back in the early 1900s, around the time of In Dahomey, that church was also around here. Yeah, we go straight on. Yeah, and you can see this lavender-coloured pharmacy block on the left. This whole block was the Gaumont Theatre. This is now called the Acorn and Gaumont House Surgery on the left bank, and that was where In Dahomey was performed. But yeah, Walker and Williams, very, very successful, very prolific. But yeah, it's important because for the first time they had an all-black performance on the British stage, and apparently King Edward learnt the cakewalk from the performers. You know, he absolutely loved it, and that's how the cakewalk became a fashionable dance amongst the great and the good and the bourgeois of these islands. But enough of singing and dancing. There's also people fighting for human rights going on. And on the left, sorry, on the right, in a short while, we're going to come across a piece of signage which indicates that, which shows us the site of Dr. Harold Moody's surgery. Remember I was talking about the slew of black doctors who lived and practiced as general practitioners in London in the early 1900s. Look at the house that we're going to pass in about 13 seconds on the right. And you can see it. 3, 2, 1. It's on the right now. See it set back from the road in that horseshoe, and you see the black man with a pensive photograph of him in the front, signalling that that was the home and the surgery of Dr. Harold Arundel Moody. And Dr. Harold Moody was a Jamaican doctor who initially came over, again in the early 1900s, 1904 yet again, to study medicine at King's College Hospital. He was the top examinant of his class. Is it examinant or examinee? Or am I just tripping? Anyway, he came top of his class, but he was still not permitted to work on the wards of King's College Hospital because of his appearance. And undaunted, undeterred, he opened his surgery, the one we just passed, there in Peckham. But like so many people that we mention in these histories, like so many people that we come across in these histories, he wasn't just a doctor. He didn't just have a day job and come back and watch Netflix, even if he could have in that time. But he was politically active, and he was the guiding light behind the foundation of the League of Coloured Peoples, founded in the early 1930s to represent the demands and the claims of political claims of black people in Great Britain during this period. Very, very interesting time. We had scattered populations, again, lots of seafarers and mariners living in communities as far apart as Glasgow, Salford, Hull, Cardiff, etc., as well as London. And he put in support networks for these people. He put in entertainment networks. He published a periodical. I'm going to embarrass myself totally by forgetting the name of it. It'll come to me on my way back home. But they published a periodical which, The Keys, thank you Tony. He published a periodical called The Keys, which can actually be seen online at the British Newspaper Archive. Go into that, pay a small fee, and it's well worth every penny, and you can see back issues of the Keys. And this was important because it was a point of political organisation for a number of people. Paul Robeson, I should have said, was a founder and member. Both Dr. Harold Moody and Dr. Belfield Clark were correspondents with W.E.B. Du Bois. The Americans know him as Du Bois, and they entertained him when he travelled here as well. Some people criticised Dr. Moody for being a bit too middle class, as well he would have been. You know, look at his house. His family was known for being comfortably off. His children went to good schools, etc., etc. He did not need to be down in the trenches with a lot of the other people. But one of his tactics, and it was a tactic for getting attention drawn to the plight of black people, was that he would have garden parties. He and Dr. Belfield Clark would host these very, very English cut cucumber sandwiches crossless cucumber sandwich garden parties and tea parties. And although they're easy to mock and deride, we can't take away the fact that they did garner a lot of attention to a lot of very, very important causes, particularly the causes of the young people, young black people, who are often without any sort of cultural centre. And one of the things Moody would do, and the League of Coloured Peoples, was to arrange trips to like Epsom Downs, for example, for young children from the East End, or trips to Hendon Aerodrome, where they could see the Black Eagle, Hubert Fauntleroy, I'm going to forget his name, this is embarrassing. They can see the Black Eagle, who was a black aerobatics expert, looping the loop at Hendon Aerodrome, etc., etc. I should have said as well, his family were very well known. I've actually met very elderly white people who remember seeing the family walking about and how respected they were. And two of his children broke the official colour bar in the British Army in the Second World War. I mean, unofficially, the colour bar for officers in the British Army had been broken in the First World War. People like Walter Tull, etc., etc. There are a fair few actually who broke the colour bar unofficially. But Moody made sure that the bar was broken officially, with the entry of his two of his children, Harold, who became a lieutenant, then a captain in the Middlesex Regiment, and his daughter Christine, who became a colonel in the medical corps, eventually running a hospital out in India. So very, very interesting people, and it's fascinating that Moody died, I think, 1948, just as almost as if he's, in a sense, I don't want to say use the word spiritually, because that's not what I mean at all, but in a poetic sense, handing over the baton to the incoming Windrush generations. Yeah, but again, this is the history of Peckham, which is hardly ever noticed, hardly ever looked at.
And just if you're interested, if you go to Great Russell Street off Tottenham Road near Oxford Street, you'll find there's a blue plaque in honor of Harold Moody, which is put up by Black History Walks. So basically, we kind of organize events like this to raise funds to put up historical blue plaques, and one of those events funded that blue plaque, which is now outside the YMCA in Great Russell Street, just off Tottenham Road. And the next plaque we're going to do is a plaque to Dr. Cecil Belfield Clark, who's also a co-founder of the League of Coloured Peoples, and that plaque will go up on the 12th of April. We should have the BMA, Cambridge University, LSBU, London Southbank University, as well as Barbados government there to unveil it. And you can all come down, it's a free event, and you can come take pictures, etc., to kind of recognize this another amazing man who was at the center of what is indeed black British rights. So much as the Americans had a fight for equality, we had the same thing over here, just that it wasn't, we didn't have Jim Crow as such, we didn't have segregation as such. There's lots of similarities between the history of this country and the history of America. So we're gonna come, well, we're almost at the end of our trip now, so the first thing I've got to do is make sure you don't leave your purses or bags or phones behind, because we'll just sell them and keep the money. So just check around your area to make sure you haven't forgotten your phone or your bag or whatever it is. We'll be getting back very, very soon, back to the PCA. Oh, the books. So Steve's book is called Incomparable World. It's actually got a whole bunch of books. So one of his books is called Incomparable World. That's the one that's been made into a TV show right now. So check out S.I. Martin, Incomparable World. The other book, of the two books he's got, is Jupiter Amidships. So it's basically an adventure story about a young black boy set in the 1800s, and includes references to real history like the Sierra Leone Academy, etc. So that book series is called Jupiter Amidships by S.I. Martin, and of course you got Incomparable World as well. And then my book is titled Black History Wars Volume 1. So it's Black History Wars Volume 1, and that details a massive amount of history in the UK, or London I should say specifically, about black history, but also it has a comparative timeline between American and black British rights. So we go from 1945 to 2020 looking at the similarities differences between the fight for equality in England as well as in America, but also we look at Australia, Kenya, and another possible as well. So that's called Black History Walks Volume 1, which you can get either physically from PC or online. There's also an audible version. There's an audible version you can get as well, and it's actually my voice on the audible version, but I don't speak as fast as I'm speaking now. But yeah, you can actually get that audible book as well. And the website that we use is blackhistorywalks.co.uk. So we do this sort of thing all the time. Every year for the last 16 years, every month for the last 16 years, we do this sort of stuff. So the website is just blackhistorywalks.co.uk, and if you go there, you can add yourself to the newsletter, and you get advanced lists of all the events that we do. Other than that, thank you very much, and we will see you hopefully next time.
Whoop, whoop, whoop.
That easily, did you? No, I can't refrain from mentioning the other person I really rate amongst others in all of these histories is Una Marson. Anyone familiar with Una Marson? Una Marson, Jamaican born. She arrives early she arrives in this country in the late 1920s from Jamaica. She dreams of being a poet, and she ends up living here in Peckham. She actually stays initially with the Moody family. She becomes the secretary to the League of Coloured Peoples, but she suddenly charts her own course. She becomes a secretary. She becomes a playwright, the first black playwright to have a performance of her work in the West End and off the West End as well. She gets her poetry published. She gets involved with the Abyssinian movement, basically supporting Haile Selassie after he'd been thrown out of Ethiopia. She becomes involved with women's rights globally and black women's rights in particular, locally and in the Caribbean. She's an extraordinary person, and she does actually have a plaque in Camberwell. But for me, her lasting legacy is her poetry, and it's the poetry that she wrote while she was living here in the landscape that we're moving through in the 1930s. And there's subjects which are still very pertinent today. She wrote Kinky Hair Blues, and you can imagine what that's about. She's talking about texturism, as the young people call it. She also wrote about the cinema industry, Hollywood, and its impact on young women. And she wrote her most telling poem, I think, which was about the racism that she experienced walking around Peckham in the 1930s, and that poem is just called N-I-G-G-E-R, that word, N-word. And she just goes into where that word comes from, how it hurts her, what it means, and how it's used by young locals in Peckham against her. Very, 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 very powerful stuff. And occasionally I go in to talk to young people in schools, and this poetry could have been written yesterday, it could be written tomorrow, but it's just very, very strong stuff, and it just shows the literal living legacy of some of these thinkers and their writings, on which note, I'll advise everybody to go online and download the writings of Equiano, of Cugoano, of Robert Wedderburn, etc., etc., because it's a huge legacy which is sadly unaddressed. Thank you.